Welcome back to our study on Christian stewardship. I'm Dave Stotz. Now, in this lesson, we're going to consider our role as responsible stewards of the environment. Now, for many, the term environmentalism conjures up images of protesters chained up to trees, of vegetarians throwing paint on ladies' fur coats, and images like these from an Earth Day celebration that looks a little more like a pagan fertility ritual. Then you have environmentalists who claim that the Bible actually encourages Christians to rape the land, and that Christian theism is the problem, and that pantheism is the answer. Their view isn't the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Their view is the earth is the Lord. Now, when we see environmentalism like this, our temptation is to write off the whole environmental movement. The answer to anti-Christian nature worship is not to ignore nature. The answer is responsible stewardship of our Father's creation. And we're going to hear from 6 men who have looked at this issue closely. The first is Don Hodel, former U.S. Secretary of the Interior.
Because I was Jim Watt's Undersecretary of the Interior when he was accused of not caring about conservation. A very hostile congressman from Oregon in a hearing had said, well, Mr. Secretary, is the reason you don't care about conserving the environment because you believe in the second coming of the Lord, which is a have you stopped beating your wife type of question. And Jim had made the decision that he was not going to challenge people over his faith. He was going to stand on his faith but not defend it in public. And so he didn't defend it. And immediately that question was converted into a statement. That's the reason he didn't care. And they, of course, demonized Jim Watt in the process. Well, I became quite interested at the time. What should he have said? And I believed that what he should have said is we are given dominion over the earth as stewards, not as despoilers of the environment, and that we have an obligation to be concerned about future generations. We don't know when the Lord's coming back, but we have an obligation to be concerned that we pass on the planet at least as habitable as it was when we came on, and hopefully better. And I think we make all kinds of arguments that that is happening in spite of the claims to the contrary. So to me, stewardship is sort of the key word.
As with other forms of stewardship, Christians should approach the issue of environmental stewardship thoughtfully. Good intentions aren't enough.
And some policy might be intended to do good, but for instance, if you wipe out a fishery or wipe out a local population because of some environmental policy that's gone awry, you won't have done what you intended to do. So if we're really concerned about the natural environment, we need to be concerned enough that we think through the consequences of our actions.
One of the areas in which environmental policy today has created actually environmental problems is the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act assumes that we're only interested in harming wildlife, and so if an endangered species is found on my property, the immediate assumption is I'm going to harm that species, and so government rushes in and creates restrictions on my use of the property. I can't modify the property, I can't go near the endangered species if there's a nest or a den, and the result is that my property is no longer my property.
It has the incentives exactly backwards. Most people want to avoid becoming under the authority of the act, and so that if you discovered an endangered species on your land, and no one knows it's there but you, your incentive is to shoot, shovel, and shut up. That's exactly backwards. We ought to reward people who have endangered species on their land, give them incentives for creating habitat and preserving habitat, and if we do that, we will then see much less political conflict and legal conflict over species in the United States.
A big environmental issue nowadays is global warming. Now, it's a complicated topic, but as responsible stewards of the environment, we really need to take the time to distinguish the facts.
There is not much dispute that we have warmed about 0.6 of a degree over the last century. We've seen swings of that over the last 1,000 years several times. We have a lot of computer models that suggest we're going to warm more, and the dispute is about whether we're going to warm a little bit or a lot. Almost every day you will find a new study a new piece of research that confounds what you knew yesterday. You'll hear the ice caps are melting. The next day you'll hear, no, they're not melting. They're melting on one side of the Antarctic, but the ice is getting thicker on the other side. And for the ordinary citizen, you get dizzy trying to follow all this.
Global warming is and should be a concern to every thinking person and to every Christian. But if we're thinking about global warming, we need to keep separate issues separate. There's basically 4 questions that you need to ask yourself when you're thinking about global warming. Is the globe warming? Is it happening? 2, if it is warming, are we causing it? 3, if it's warming and we're causing it, is that bad? And 4, if 1, 2, and 3 are true, would any of the policies advocated to affect global warming make any difference in the first place? You have to answer those questions and in that order with some degree of certainty before you really know what to do with respect to global warming.
Now, let's take these 4 questions one at a time. Number 1, is the planet getting warmer? Now, as Steve Hayward noted, most everyone in the debate agrees that the planet has indeed warmed about 0.6 of a degree Celsius over the last century. The planet has warmed 1 degree Celsius over the last century and a half. That leads us to question number 2. If the planet has indeed gotten warmer, are we the main cause?
Well, with regard to is there a consensus on what's causing the warming, in short, no, there is not a consensus that this warming that we're seeing is due strictly to mankind.
There are very persuasive scientists who say mankind is having a significant or maybe a major role in the climate change we've seen in the last century. The theory is that mankind is putting too many heat-trapping gases into the atmosphere, mostly carbon dioxide, but a few other things. At the other pole, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that this is mostly happening from natural causes, from changes in solar radiation, from changes in wind patterns. We know that there have been climate changes of fairly wide magnitude in the last 2,000 and 3,000 years, and this was long before you had sport utility vehicles on the road.
We know from both human records and also from geological records, like the evidence embedded in ice cores, that the global climate has varied significantly. There was a Roman warming period about the time of Christ, and then a Roman cooling period about the time of the collapse of the Roman Empire. Then we had a medieval warming about 1,000 years ago, which led then to a little ice age about 1350, which led again to another warming. It was so warm 1,000 years ago that Vikings actually settled Greenland. It later had to be abandoned during the Little Ice Age. Human activities during the industrial era could have had nothing to do with these past climate swings. So we really need to consider the possibility that we have natural causes, both obviously in the past, but also in the present. If you look at records of Earth's past climate, there is a correlation between the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere and the global temperature. But what's interesting is that if you look at the records carefully, in most cases, you'll get a global increase in temperature, and then a few hundred years later, an increase in the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, if the increase in carbon dioxide happens after the increase in global temperature, then it can't have caused the increase in temperature. Ask yourself this question: what's the optimum global temperature? Have you ever heard a newscaster on the nightly news tell you that 15 degrees Celsius is the optimum average temperature for the Earth's climate? No, because we actually don't know what the optimum climate is. But it's only if you know what the optimum climate is that you'd be able to determine whether it's a good or bad thing that the Earth seems to be warming. I mean, look at a map of Canada. The vast majority of Canadians live within a few miles of their southern border with the United States. And it's not because they're in love with Americans.
If you look at just a map of the globe, where's an awful lot of the land mass in this world? It's way up high in the north, where the weather is really, really cold for a lot of the year. And so even the official scientific assessments of this problem have said a warmer world has certain benefits: longer growing season, increased food production in some areas.
Trees treat CO2, carbon dioxide, as food. The more CO2 there is in the atmosphere for many trees, the greater the growth of the trees will be. And those trees sequester the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So think about that. Humans might release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and then increase the growth of trees, which would then sequester that CO2 that humans had put in the atmosphere.
When we're going to evaluate these things, we have to look at not just what might happen and the bad side. You do have to look at the good, and then you say, well, what's the net?
If global warming is a real concern and we're causing it, what policies would actually do anything to help the problem? We need to ask this question in regard to the best known proposed solution to global warming, namely the Kyoto Protocol.
The Kyoto Protocol is an effort by the developed countries to try to reduce carbon dioxide.
Carbon dioxide, that's what we all breathe out with every breath, and that's what plants live on. It's not, strictly speaking, a noxious pollutant. It comes into play because it's a greenhouse gas. Although we can get the noxious pollutants out of cars and power plants and industrial facilities, because carbon dioxide is the result of complete combustion, it's a much harder problem to tackle.
The Kyoto Treaty calls for nations to reduce their use of fossil fuels, gasoline, natural gas, coal, home heating oil. Now, the United States has not joined the treaty, and China and India are exempt. Now, the focus of this lesson is not the Kyoto Protocol, but the protocol does illustrate the importance of slowing down and asking that fourth question anytime we run into an environmental concern. Will proposed changes fix the problem? Now, many people move from a concern about global warming to the conviction that all people of goodwill should support the Kyoto Protocol. But as stewards of God's creation, we have the responsibility to slow down and consider whether or not a proposed solution will actually be effective. Many people are surprised to learn that people on both sides of the global warming debate agree that the Kyoto Protocol would not be effective.
Even if Kyoto was 100% complied with, including the U.S. and Australia participated in it, you might get 0.2 of a degree Fahrenheit difference in temperature by 2050. You wouldn't even actually probably be able to measure the difference.
If you ask environmentalists, well, what's this all about? They'd say, well, Kyoto was step one. Well, if step one is so difficult and unattainable, what is step two going to be? And what is that going to cost?
Many people are arguing for an increased use in solar, nuclear, hydroelectric, and wind power, since these energy sources don't create carbon dioxide. But experts on both sides agree that even an aggressive use of these alternative fuel sources would only reduce carbon dioxide by a tiny percentage over the coming decades. So how do they propose that we make a serious dent in carbon dioxide emissions? Well, the supporters of the Kyoto Protocol argue that nations should just use less energy. Is there a draft in here?
If you tried to do something that was significant, you would need to have 60% reductions in carbon dioxide to try to actually get the CO2 levels to stay where they are now. Well, how smart do we have to be to figure out that trying to eliminate 60% of the gasoline usage and other fossil fuel usage, coal would count. We make a lot of electricity, 60% of electricity from coal. I mean, ruinous would be the answer. It would be ruinous to the economy to try to get to a meaningful level of reduction in greenhouse gases.
Most of the world is energy poor. They burn dung, they burn sticks to keep their homes, their food cooked and so forth. They have no conditioning, they have no motive power save whatever draft animals give them. If they're going to have a lifestyle anything like we do in the future, they're going to have to use much more energy. And to deny them that opportunity, to say, let's stop the world, we're happy where it is now, is obscene. And much of the modern environmental movement is a pro-poverty movement, to preserve the indigenous way of life in the third world. The indigenous way of life in the third world is poverty and early death, and that is nothing anyone should want to preserve.
If we do anything drastic, we will be affecting and killing people, starving people to death, or causing disease in this next year or the year after that. Because in the economic pyramid, it's the people at the bottom of the economic pyramid who have no flexibility. They have no margin. There are people in this world who will die by the decisions that are made to cut off energy.
The thing that we often don't realize is that environmental quality is actually an expensive good. Just visit third world countries in Asia or Africa. Look at the streets, look at the sewage in the streets, look at the pollutants in the rivers. It's clear that in very poor economies, environmental stewardship is not as significant of an issue for the population as simple survival becomes. What this means is that poor economies are in general much harder on the environment than rich economies are. So any environmental solution that we might propose that actually increases poverty is ironically going to tend to harm the environment.
We have to be somewhat wealthy in order to tackle environmental problems. And if you try to have solutions that drag down an economy, you're going to find out you're probably not going to try to resolve those problems anymore because you're not wealthy enough to do so.
The issue of global warming is an issue that ought to be of concern to Christians. But we also ought to be careful not to jump on whatever the popular bandwagon is. If we think carefully and deliberately about these issues, there are sure to be solutions to any real environmental problems that come our way that will, on balance, help rather than harm those who can least afford it, namely the poor.
When we reflect that we are creators made in the image of the Creator, when we reflect on the history of progress made in Christendom, we have good reasons to expect that human beings have the God-given capacity to solve new environmental problems as they arise, not by going backwards, but by moving forward creatively.
The reason I do the Index of Leading Environmental Indicators on Earth Day every year is it seems to me that we ought to take notice of the things we're doing right, the places we're making progress, and the reasons why we're making progress, because there might be lessons we can apply to other areas of environmental concern. So, for example, at the time of the first Earth Day in 1970, people said, well, the Great Lakes are like the American Dead Sea. There have been declines in toxic traces of chemicals in the Great Lakes of up to 90% since the 1970s, a substantial recovery in wildlife around the Great Lakes, including endangered species. And in a lot of areas, you can go swimming in the Great Lakes again, you can fish in the Great Lakes again.
It's really a non-negotiable theologically, if you're a Christian, to say that we are stewards. We are responsible for the natural environment that God has given us. But what's central to the Christian doctrine of the environment is that human beings are part of God's good created order. We are God's crowning achievement. We were created in His image. This is a very important difference that Christians have with many in the mainstream environmental movement. The Texas Academy of Science recently named Professor Eric Pianka the Texas Distinguished Scientist of the Year. And in Pianka's speech that he gave upon receiving this award, he actually celebrated the possibility of a mutated Ebola virus knocking out 80% of the human population. Now, this wasn't something that he predicted or suggested with any kind of regret. He literally celebrated or relished the possibility. Ideas have consequences, and in the debate over the environment, there is a very perverse and anti-Christian idea, and it's the fundamentally anti-human belief that human beings are a virus or a pox upon the created order. That's not an option that any Christian that's thinking clearly as a Christian can ever entertain.
There are many people, including religious leaders, who say that the essential problem is a problem of resource, and that if it's a problem of resource, then it's a problem of population. This is what I call humanophobia. The image in the humanophobe's mind is that the human person is one big mouth that is constantly ingesting and then polluting. When in point of fact, certainly consumption is part of what we all do. Every time I take a breath, I'm consuming air. But we also produce. If each human being is him or herself a potential creator of wealth and resources, then it changes the whole terms of the debate.
There is a biblical basis for us to be concerned about our environment. It starts in Genesis. God made a beautiful creation. The most beautiful thing in that creation is us. It's humanity. We're the only thing in His image. We are the one creature capable of being stewards.
So what is the biblical approach to environmental stewardship in the 21st century? to care effectively for our Father's creation, including the pinnacle of His creation, humankind. We shouldn't dismiss any good effort to this end, large or small. Landscaping a yard, adopting a highway, spending some time getting informed about global environmental issues. If Christians around the world made a little difference, what a difference that would make. What a difference it's already making. Many of our missionaries have taken the gospel to people living in scenes of waste and hopelessness. Many times when these people come to realize that they are children of God, a royal priesthood, first their homes, then their entire communities are transformed. That's because the most important renewable resource of all is the gospel of Christ, the message that we're called to be sons and stewards of the Creator of heaven and earth. Thanks for joining me on our second lesson on Christian stewardship. I'm Dave Stotts.